Preface. On June 11, 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper would formally apologize for the federal government's role in the residential school program, initiating a 7-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission. While far from perfect, it was the first attempt of any real substance to right the wrongs of the past, or at least to properly understand them. It also resulted in tens of thousands of hours of research and testimony, without which this book would not be possible. Introduction. In Canada, the Indian residential school system was a network of mandatory boarding schools for Indigenous peoples. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administered by Christian churches. The school system was created to remove Indigenous children from the influence of their own culture and assimilate them into the dominant European Canadian culture. Over the course of the system's more than 100-year existence, at least 150,000 children were placed in residential schools nationally. By the 1930s, about 30% of Indigenous children were believed to be attending residential schools. The number of school-related deaths remains unknown due to incomplete records. Estimates range from 3,200 to over 30,000. Over the last few years, the history of the relationship between Canada's Indigenous peoples, the Government of Canada, and the Church has come to the forefront of public discourse. A darker shade has been applied to the colonial history of the country, which has had mixed results in acceptance from average Canadians. In the era of wokeness, these topics can become even more incendiary than they have been historically, and even more careful attention must be made to how they are reported and discussed. Let me be clear that the point of this book is not to throw fuel on an already raging fire, but to make sure that in the discussion the voices of the students that attended these institutions is not lost in the political noise that frequents our reality in early 2022. Governments and institutions have historically been the largest purveyors of human suffering, and the case of the Canadian residential school system fits the mold. The relationship between Canadians and First Nations is one that would be better served by open dialogue than with legislation. We cannot move into a better or more unified future until the mistakes of the past are, at a minimum, realized. First Nations communities find themselves still to this day reeling and recovering from a culturally traumatic experience that is less than a generation past. Poverty, substance abuse, and suicide plague many Indigenous communities to this day, and unless we learn the why of the situation, correcting it for future generations seems impossible. This book will avoid policy and solutions and focus more on storytelling, though not by the author, by the testimony of hundreds of Indigenous people that attended the schools over the last 50, 60 years, as recounted to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada between 2008 and 2015. In their own words, we can hope to come to learn the pain they experienced daily, what it was like to be taken away from your family and community and raised in the schools, sometimes not seeing your family for months or years, and in still more sad and extreme cases, never again. While painful, reading these accounts offer us all a brighter future, less affected by judgment and misunderstanding and more favorable to empathy. It's time to move beyond blaming and shaming and into an era of understanding and compassion between Canada and First Nations communities. The point of this book is not to lay blame, but instead to start a conversation about our tumultuous past and how, with that past in mind, we can move forward together. Before the schools. In this chapter, students reminisce on happier and simpler times before the forced attendance of residential schools. Canada's Indigenous populations existed for thousands of years off the land and were still in a period of adjustment to the onset of Europeans and the creation of reserves. In the mid-1880s, the residential school system would come into being, and by 1920, amendments to the Indian Act would make attendance mandatory and make attendance at any other institution illegal. The system was brought in by Prime Minister John A. Macdonald after sending Nicholas Flood Davin to study industrial schools for Indigenous children in the United States. Davin's recommendation to follow the U.S. example of aggressive civilization led to public funding for the Canadian residential school system. If anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within a circle of civilized conditions. Davin wrote in his 1879 report on industrial schools for Indians and half-breeds. While these students would have already been living under the reserve system for several years, mandatory attendance was to catch them off guard. Taking children once raised by the extended family and greater community into institutions to be raised by the government and church officials, who had little to no regard for their culture, and in extreme cases, even their safety. In this first chapter, we will hear some accounts from life before being taken to the schools, to live for months and even years at a time. Bob Baxter.
When I think back to my childhood, it brings back memories, really nice memories of how life was as Anishinaabe. As you know, how we lived before we were sent to school. The things that I remember, the legends at night that my dad used to tell us, stories, and how he used to show us how to trap and funny things that happened. You know, there's a lot of things that are still in my thoughts of how we were loved by our parents. They really cared for us. And it was such a good life, you know. It's doing the things like, it was free. We were free, I guess is the word I'm looking for. There's a real free environment of us. I'm not saying that we didn't get disciplined if we did something wrong, you know. There was that, but it was a friendly, like a loving discipline, if you will.
Louise Bosom.
I'm come from a long way. I came a long way. I'm from Great Lake, Mistissini. That's where I was born in the bush. It was a pride for me to say that because I was born in the bush in a tent. It's something that remains in my heart, going to the woods, living in the woods. It's in my heart. Before going to the boarding school, my parents often told me what they were doing in the woods when I was born. What they were doing, we were in camp with other families. The stories my father told us, my mother too.
Before she was enrolled in residential school in Quebec in the 1960s, Therese Niquet lived on what she described as the family territory. She had very positive memories of that part of her life.
I remember especially the winter landscapes, fall landscapes too. I remember very well I often looked at my father, hunting beaver especially. I admired my father a lot, and I remember at one point I was looking at him. I think I was on the small hill and he was below. He had made a hole in the ice and he was hunting beaver with a harpoon, and I was there and I was looking at him and I was singing. And I remember when I was a kid I sang a lot, very often. And I also remember that we lived, or my paternal grandmother was often with us, my father's mother. And we lived in a large family also, an extended family in the bush. Those are great memories.
Jeanette Coucou, who attended the La Tuque Quebec school in the 1960s, said she was a member of what might be the last generation of Aboriginal people who were raised in the forest.
In the forest, what I remember of my childhood was bearskin, which I liked. I was there and it was the bearskin that my father put for us to sit on. That was it. That is why I'm pleased to see that here. And what I remember in my childhood also was my mother's songs, because we lived in tents and there was young children, and my mother sang for the youngest. And at the same time, this helped us to fall asleep. It was beneficial to everyone. My mother's songs, and that is what I remember. That is what I am happy to say, that it was what I was raised with and what was instilled in me, so to speak.
Albert Elias grew up in the Northwest Territories near the community of Tuktoyaktuk.
Yeah, when I first opened, like when I first saw the world, I guess, we were outdoors. And when I opened my eyes and started to, and I just a baby, I guess, and we were out in the land. The land was all around me, the snow, the sky, the sun, and I had my parents. And we had a dog team. We were traveling, I think it was on Banks Island. And I was amazed at what I saw, just the environment, the peace, the strength, the love, the smile on my dad's face. And when I wake up, he's singing a short song to me of love.
Bob Baxter was born on the Albany River in northern Ontario.
So that's how I grew up, And knowing all that stuff, we're listening to the familiar sounds of my dad's snowshoes in the winter when he came back from trapping late in the afternoon towards when it's already dark, and waiting for him to come home and tell us the legends, because there's no TV back then. So it was great. My mom was great too. She really looked after us, made sure that we were clothed and fed. That was good times. I remember eating wild game all the time. Because we had our grandparents that really looked after us too. I have good memories of, until that day we were taken away to school.
Prior to attending the Roman Catholic school in Kenora, Ontario, Linda Paffasay MacDonald lived with her family near Sydney Lake in northwestern Ontario in the 1950s.
We spent most of our time in the trap line in the cabin, and we'd play outside, and it was really good. There was no drinking. It was a small sized cabin, and my parents took good care of us. And I remember those happy days. Like, there was no violence. We had a little bit of food, but we always had a meal. Like, we ate the beaver meat or moose meat if my dad got a moose, and deer meat and fish.
She could not recall being physically disciplined during this time.
They more or less just told me, don't do this. You'll hurt yourself and whatnot, but it was all in Ojibwe. All spoken in Ojibwe. And I spoke Ojibwe when I was a child, and there was a lot of fun. And my parents would take us out blueberry picking, and my grandparents would always take us blueberry picking. Or we'd go in a canoe and we'd go, or my grandmother would always be gathering traditional medicines. She had picked the wild ginger, and I would go with her, and we'd go pick all the medicines that we needed. And I also remember my mom picking up this medicine, and it would, if we had any cut or open wound, she would use this like a ball, like sort of a fungus ball, and she would open it and she would put it on our wound or whatever and would heal, real fast. And she knew all her traditional medicines. And at the time, I remember my grandpa and my dad, they used to have a drum, and they would, drum, and they would sing during certain times of the year.
Mabel Brown had similar memories of her life growing up in the Northwest Territories.
Life in the bush is really good. And when we were growing up, when my dad was alive, him and my mom brought us out into the bush. And we went as a family together. They taught us how to do things. They'd tell us first, they'd show us, and then we'd do it. And then that's how we learned that. And that's how so many people now know when we see a snare or how to set it or set traps, because my grandmother showed me how to set traps and how to tell what kind of trees are what and what the different kinds of things you take off the gum and things like that, and when it's used for what it's used for. And chew, and my mom and dad used to dig up roots from the ground, and I used to just love that, roots. Chew on it, and all those things are medicine for our bodies too. And I still can't eat just store-bought foods. I have to have caribou or fish or moose meat or something like that, and to feel full, to feel satisfied.
Emily Kamach was born in 1953 in York Factory, Manitoba, and grew up in York Landing.
My family is Cree in origin. My mom and dad spoke Cree, and that's my native language, is Cree. And that's the only language I spoke at home. And when I was 6 years old, I only understood basic, really, from my brothers and sisters when they came back from residential school. What is your name? And I knew to say Emily and not very much English. And I was very close to my mother. Her and I was just attached to her. I love my mother, and I knew she loved me. Same with my father. He showed it in different ways. He was a very quiet man, but his actions spoke volumes. He hunted. He was a hunter, a trapper, a fisherman. And that's how we survived, my family, because he didn't work. He didn't have a job. And my father was what they call a lay reader in the Anglican faith. He led church services in my community, and my family was Anglican in faith. My father ran the services in my hometown of York Landing. He did the services in Cree, and that's what I miss about our community right now, is the Cree singing, because it's not around anymore.
Peter Ernick was born near Repulse Bay, in what is now Nunavut.
I lived in an igloo in the wintertime. A very happy upbringing with my family, and both my mother and my father were very good storytellers. And they would tell legends, and they would sing traditional Inuit songs. My father in particular, would talk about hunting stories. My mother would sew all the clothes that we had, caribou clothing and things like that, sealskin clothing. I still wear sealskin clothing today, particularly my boots, when I'm dancing, for example. So my mother would sew, teaching my sister how to sew, so that she would become a very good seamstress when she grows up or older. And in the meantime, I was apparently being trained to be a good Inuk, be able to hunt animals for survival: caribou, seals, a square flipper, bearded seal, Arctic char, these kinds of things, including birds. And I was also being taught how to build an igloo, a snow house. When I was a little boy, growing up to be a young boy at that time, my other memories include walking on the land with my father. My father was my mentor. He was a great hunter. So I would go out with him on the land, walking in search of caribou, and I'd watch him each time he caught a caribou, and I would learn by observing. As Inuit, I learned a long, long time ago that you learn by observation. That's what I was doing as a little boy, becoming a young man at that particular period of time. So in the wintertime, we would travel by dog team. I remember traveling by dog team as early as 3 or 4 years old. Hunting, again, hunting is a way of life that I remember when I was growing up for survival. And caribou hunting and seal hunting and fishing. And my father also did some trapping, foxes.
Anthony Henry was born in Swan Lake, Ontario.
I was born in a tent in the woods, so I was brought to the world in a very harsh environment, which I guess is a good thing because it made me the tough guy I am.
He said he was raised in a traditional lifestyle based on trapping, hunting, fishing, and harvesting of edible plants, such as wild rice and other edible materials.
Total traditional style is what I call it. My parents were extraordinary people. They prepared me to be an independent individual. They taught me a lot of things that I've used throughout my life as a traditional person. They taught me how to survive.
As Albert Fiddler was growing up in Saskatchewan, his father taught him how to live off the land.
I remember my dad teaching me how to hunt and learn how to snare rabbits, learn how to take care of horses. I was riding horses already on 4 years old, and I'm riding them with a bareback. And I enjoy that thing. I still remember that because I was a fairly decent cowboy, like Little Beaver, as they used to call him in the comic books. I used to hang on to just the mane. I didn't even have a bridle.
His father also taught him how to hunt.
And it's funny sometimes, and some of it was fun. Some of it was kind of patience, and pretty chilly sometimes when he was telling me how to snare chickens out of the willows. We were using a little wire and a long stick and standing on the dark side and waiting for the chickens to come and feed on the willows. And now we'd snare them down, yeah.
Doris Young attended residential schools in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Her early childhood was spent in northern Manitoba.
The family that I had, my mother and father and my brothers and sisters and my grandparents and my aunties and uncles. The community I lived in was a safe one. It was a place where we were cared for and loved by our parents and our grandparents. And that community I lived at, we were safe. We were well taken care of. We lived on the land, on the water, meaning by fishing. My dad was a chief, but he was also what we would call a laborer in those days. But he was also a hunter, trapper, and fisherman. And that's how he supported us. And my mother spoke only Cree, and that's the language that we spoke in our household. And she taught us it was very important for us to have that language because it was the basis of our culture as I came to understand it later in life. And she was the only one that enforced the language that we spoke in our house.
Dolores Adolph was born in 1951 and grew up in a self-sufficient Aboriginal family in British Columbia.
Before I came to residential school, our families fished and hunted for our food. Our mother, she grew our own vegetables because we were quite a ways from the stores. And because we lived in the remote area where there's no stores. And our means of travel was canoes, so that's how we traveled. And our home life, it was not the greatest, but what our parents were trying to teach us how to be, keep busy, and then for us not to say there's nothing to do. So we packed water and we packed our wood. Sometimes we had to roll our wood up the dike and then roll it down to the other side. And we had to learn how to cut our wood and make kindling for the fire. And that was our way of life. And my grandfather was busy trying to teach us how to build canoes, make paddles, build a baler to bail water out of our canoe. And then they were trying to teach us how to race on those old fishing canoes, and we always beat the boys, and they didn't like that because we beat them all the time. So that meant that we were strong at that point, before we came to residential school. And my life has been upside down since I came to residential school.
Rosalie Weber, who later attended a boarding school in Newfoundland, spent her early childhood with her parents in Labrador in the 1940s.
My father was a fisherman, and my mother also worked with him, and they worked together. He was a trapper, and my mom trapped with him. Also, my mom made all of our clothes and all of his clothing. And they knitted and they cooked, and my mom was a midwife. It was very happy. We were always busy with the family. Everything was a family thing, I remember gathering water from one of the little brooks that ran through Spotted Islands where I was born. I remember, the dogs. I remember my brothers, and I had one sister, and I had another sister, a stepsister, but she lived in Newfoundland, and I didn't know her. We were quite happy, and my mother was a hunter like my dad. They'd go out in partridge season and always in competition, and with a single 22, she'd come in and with about 150, and he'd be lucky to make the 100. And then the community would take it, and it would be bottled and canned for the winter provisions, because being a trapper in the wintertime, they all had their own trapping areas, so many of them went in their own trap lines, and as we did, and my father trapped in Porcupine Bay. And so we would journey there when fishing season was over. I was just a small child, so I remember.
Martha Loon was born in 1972 in northwestern Ontario and attended the Poplar Hill, Ontario School in the 1970s. Stories were a large part of the education she received from her parents.
There were stories that, they taught us how to behave. They taught us our values. We even just, hear stories about the beaver, and I always used to wonder why my mom would, every time she was skinning beaver, she'd always set aside the kneecaps separately. She'd put those aside. And then afterwards, she'd go either paddle out to the water somewhere, like a deep part, and that's where she threw them in. And I always wondered why she would do that. I've never questioned. It wasn't until I was older I asked her, why do you do that? She says, this is what we're supposed to do, to respect and honor the beaver, to thank the beaver for giving its life so that we could eat it, use its pelt. This is what the beaver wants us to do. The same thing as you treat a duck, the duck bones a certain way. All that's got purpose and a reason for it.
Grandparents played an important role in raising children in many communities. Richard Hall, who went to the Alberni, British Columbia School, recalled with deep affection his pre-residential school upbringing and the role that his grandparents played.
And my grandmother, she taught us to be orderly. She taught us to go to church. She dressed us to go to church. She loved the church. My playground was my friends. With my friends was the mountains, streams, the ocean. And we're raised in the ocean because we went fishing all summer long, and we traveled to the communities, the fishing grounds, because at the mountains were places where we spend our days, times, the rivers, from playing in the river, no fear, and that was normal. With my grandfather, he took me with him at the young age. He taught me to work in the boats with him. He taught me how to repair boats. He would take me to talk to his friends, and all he did was to speak their language and speak their native tongue while they prepared fish around the fire. He took me wherever he went, and I later learned that he was my lifeline. He helped me and guided me the best he could.
Patrick James Hall was born in 1960 and grew up in what is now called the Dakota Teepee First Nation.
And I remember a lot of times, I guess, with my grandfather and my grandmother. One of them in my mind I remember. My grandfather used to haul wood on a sleigh. He had horses, and so my older brothers would go with him too. And he'd take us for horse rides, and he used to talk with us all the time in Dakota. I mean, we used to remember what he said because we'd always be laughing, having fun, and my grandpa was a very, very active guy. He always made sure, he made sure that we had everything for the family. We used to go hunting, deer hunting and fishing, trapping. And my mother too, she was a very hard worker because she used to be hauling water, cutting wood. That was just during the winters. It was very hard because we have to cut wood and break the ice for water and heat it up for the stove.
One former student who attended residential school in the Northwest Territories recalled that her home life was violent and frightening.
There was a lot of violence. We were very afraid of my father. He was a very angry man, and my mother used to run away on him, and he used to come home to us kids and then just really verbally abuse us and make us really scared of him. I used to run to the neighbors and hide behind their door because I was so scared of him.
kidnapped by institutions. Imagine, if you can, back to your earliest childhood memories. The safety most of us felt around our loved ones, having our mothers, fathers, grandparents, and siblings in our lives to help lighten the load and comfort us in hard times. Or perhaps you're a parent. Imagine the church or the state showing up at your door and, under the threat of violence via incarceration, demanding your children as young as 6 be taken by them to an institution of their choosing to be properly educated and/or re-educated. This was the reality faced by many Indigenous parents and grandparents in the late 19th and early 20th century in Canada, and several other countries such as the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, to name a few. In this chapter, the focus will be that moment of departure. How did it feel to be ripped away from your family when you were only a child and brought someplace where you couldn't understand the culture or the language? Through the stories of those that were there, we can try and imagine ourselves in their shoes, as uncomfortable as that may be. Your family.
It must have been in the summer the Indian agent came to see my father. I imagine it must have been the Indian agent because it looked pretty serious. He was talking to him for some time, and because we couldn't understand, we couldn't even eavesdrop what they were talking about. So after some time spent there, Father sat us down and told us that this Indian agent came to tell him that we had to go to school, to a boarding school, one that is not close to our home, but far away.
The official had told her father that he would be sent to jail if he did not send Antoine to residential school.
We were sort of caught in wanting to stay home and seeing our parents go to jail, and we must have thought, who's going to look after us if our parents go to jail?
In the late 1940s, Vitaline Elsie Jenner was living with her family in northern Alberta.
My mom and dad loved me, loved all of us a lot. They took care of us the best that they knew how, and I felt so comfortable being at home. This came to an end in the fall of 1951. My parents were told that we had to go to residential school, and prior to that, at times, my dad didn't make very much money, so sometimes he would go to the welfare to get ration or get some monies to support 12 of us. And my parents were told that if they didn't put us in residential school, that all that would be cut off. So my parents felt forced to put us in the residential school, 8 of us, 8 out of 12.
Many parents sent their children to residential school for one reason. They had been told they would be sent to jail if they kept their children at home. Ken A. Little Deer's father told him that,
"If I didn't go to school, he'd go to jail. That's what he told me."
as a result, he was enrolled in the Sioux Lookout, Ontario school. Andrew Bull Calf was raised by his grandfather, Herbert Bull Calf. When he was enrolled in residential school in Cardston, Alberta, his grandfather was told
That if he didn't bring me, my grandfather would go to jail and be charged.
When Martha Manus told her mother she did not wish to return to the Roman Catholic school in Cardston, her mother explained,
If you don't go to school, your dad is going to go to jail. We're going to get a letter written in red, and that's very serious.
Maureen Gloria Johnson went to the Lower Port School in northern British Columbia in 1959.
I went there with a bus. They loaded us all up on a bus and took us. And I remember my mom had a really hard time letting us kids go. And she had a really hard time. She begged the priest, and the priest said that it was law that we had to go. And if we didn't go, then my parents would be in trouble.
In the face of such coercion, parents often felt helpless and ashamed. Paul Dixon attended residential schools in Ontario and Quebec. Once he spoke to his father about his experience at the schools. According to Dixon,
He got angry and said, "I had no choice, you know. It really hit me hard. I wasn't accusing him of anything, you know. I just wanted some explanations." He said, I will go. I would go in jail. I will go in jail if I didn't let you go."
when she was 4 or 5, Linda Papasi McDonald was taken by plane from her parents' home on Sydney Lake, Ontario.
I looked outside. My mom was, flailing her arms, and she must have been crying. And I see my dad grabbing her, and I was wondering why my mom was, she was struggling. She told me many years later what happened, and she explained to me why we had to be sent away to residential school. And And I just couldn't get that memory out of my head. And I still remember to this day what happened that day. And she told me like she was so hurt. And I used to ask her, why did you let us go? Like, why didn't you stop them, you know? Why didn't you, you know, come and get us? And she told me we couldn't. They told us if we tried to do anything, like get you guys back, we'd get thrown in jail. So they didn't want to end up in jail because they still had babies at the cabin.
Dorothy Ross recalled how unhappy her father was about sending his children to residential school.
As we got older, I remember Dad. I knew Dad was already angry. He was angry at the school for taking us away, for taking myself and my siblings. He couldn't do anything to help us. Either, same thing with my mom, there's nothing I can do to help you.
Albert Marshall hated his parents for sending him to the Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia school. Many years later, he asked his brother what the family reaction had been to his being sent to school. He didn't answer me for a while, a long time. He says,
Nobody said anything for days because my father was crying every day. Finally, my father told the family, I failed as a father. I couldn't protect my child. I just couldn't because you know what the Mounties, the priests, the Indian agents told me? He told me if I resist too much, then they would take the other younger brother and younger children. Then he says, there's not a choice. I could not say take them or take the three of them, but I couldn't say nothing, and I know I have to live with that.
Jacko Anaviapik's parents opposed his being sent to the Pond Inlet Hostel in what is now Nunavut.
When he started taking kids on the land to attend school, the RCMP boat would come pick us up. There's no doubt that our parents were intimidated by the police into letting us go. They were put in a position where they could not say no. Even though they did not want us to go, they were too afraid of the police, too afraid to stand up to the police. I'm one of the lucky ones because my father did say no when they wanted to take me. He told them he would bring me himself once the ice had formed. I was brought here after the children who had been rounded up by the boat had already started. That first year, my parents came several times to take me home, but they were refused by the area administrator. My sister told me that my parents were very sad at that time.
Rather than be separated from their children, his parents moved to Pond Inlet.
After 2 years had passed, my family decided to move to Pond because they knew I had to go to school.
In some cases, parents reluctantly sent their children because the residential school represented their only educational option. Ellen Smith's father attended the Anglican residential school at Hay River in the Northwest Territories. She believes that his experiences at the school led him to oppose her being sent to residential school. However, her grandfather believed it was necessary that she get an education.
My dad reluctantly let me go to school because my grandpa said that in the future she will help our people. She needs to go there. And that struggle occurred with my dad over the years, for 11 years that I went to residential school. But my grandpa was the one that said, they have to go. She has to go.
She was sent to the Anglican school in Aklavik in 1953. She eventually attended 3 other residential schools. Some parents wanted their children to gain the knowledge they believed was needed to protect their community and culture. When Shirley Williams' father took her to catch the bus to the Spanish Ontario Girls' School, he bought her an ice cream and gave her 4 instructions.
1 was remember who you are. Do not forget your language. Whatever they do to you in there, be strong. And the 4th one, learn about the Indian Act and come back and teach me. So with those 4 things, he said that you don't know why I'm telling you this, but someday you will understand.
One student who attended the Gordon's Saskatchewan school recalled the ways in which the churches competed against one another to recruit students.
But when we look at the residential schools, and the churches, we recognize, at least I've seen it, that we've had these 2 competing religions, the Anglican and the Catholic churches, both competing for our souls, it seemed. I remember growing up on the reserve here when they were looking for our students. They were competing against each other. We were the prizes, that they would gain if they won. I remember the Catholic priests coming out with, used hockey equipment and telling us, come to our school. Come and play hockey for us. Come and play in our band. We got all kinds of bands here. We got trombones and trumpets and drums and all that kind of stuff. We used all this stuff to encourage us or to entice us to come to the Catholic school. Then on the other hand, the Anglicans, they would come out with what they called bale clothes. They would bring out a bunch of clothes in a bale, like a big, big bale. It was all used clothing, and they'd give it to the woman on the reserve here. And the woman made blankets and stuff like that out of these old clothes. But that's the way they competed for us as people.
Some children wanted to go to school, at least initially. Leon Wallen, who attended the Roman Catholic residence in Fort Smith in the 1960s, said he looked forward to residential school.
Because I wanted to learn to talk English and learn, so I can learn both languages at the same time.
He hated his first year at the residence, particularly the restrictions on speaking his own language. But he said,
My mom and dad didn't listen to me, but they still sent me back.
In other cases, missionaries convinced students of the benefits of going to school. Anthony Henry said that a priest named Father LaSalle convinced him to come to residential school at Kenora. According to Henry, his mother did not want him to go to residential school, but LaSalle, who spoke fluent Ojibwe, convinced him it would be beneficial.